Okay, so the oven is ready. It has been preheating with the cast iron Dutch oven in it, so it's really hot. And I wanted to explain a few concepts to you. What we're going to do is the bread, I've taken it out of the refrigerator and I'm going to put it onto some parchment paper and score it with a lamb. This is a lamb, and it's spelled L-A-M-E. Some people score because it's very decorative, and yes, it can be very artistic and intricate, but the real purpose of scoring the dough is to allow it to expand. So what happens when you put the dough into an intense heat, because the dough has a higher hydration percentage of water in the dough, it'll create the steam. And as it creates the steam and the carbon dioxide molecules expand, it'll expand the bread. And what we want to do is allow the dough to expand in a controlled way. So this is why we score. We are creating an area of least resistance, and that is where the dough is just going to expand. So I use parchment paper. You don't have to when you get familiar with how your dough works. But as I said in an earlier video, you can always reuse parchment paper, which you can see I've done. Otherwise, if you're using a new piece of parchment paper, take a piece of parchment paper, and the best thing to do is just to scrunch it up. And this makes it a lot more malleable than if it was a stiff piece of paper. Okay, so I'm going to take my dough out of the bag. I'm going to put the parchment paper on it, and I'm going to flip it over, and it should come out fairly easily if you floured your banneton well. And you can see how it creates these striations here. So this is the lamb, and what you're aiming for is a 45-degree angle, not straight, because it just doesn't split correctly. And you have to be confident and make your stroke. So you're not going to be hacking or zigzagging for your scoring, but just one deft movement and create one good cut, about a half an inch. So there you go. You see how I actually got it a little hooked on to the corner here, and that's how that happened. But this is good because, you know, it's a 45-degree angle, and this is where it's going to expand. For the purpose of this particular video, I am only going to do one big score and show you how the area of least resistance is going to occur here as the bread expands or rises due to oven spring in the cast iron Dutch oven. This is where it's going to be splitting. All right, so now I'm going to put this into the very hot Dutch oven. Okay, here's my Dutch oven. It's very hot. And I'm going to take my bread and just place it down like this. And then I'm going to cover this, and it's going to bake in a 450-degree F oven for 25 minutes, and then I'm going to take off the lid, and then it'll be browning for 25 minutes. This is for a dough ball that started off with about 500 grams of flour. Okay, 25 minutes is up, and I always call this the moment of truth. So this is where I'm going to take off the lid on the Dutch oven. And normally I try to do this as quickly as possible so not to lose any heat. All right, so this is just going to go in for 25 more minutes, and that will be the brown egg. 25 minutes with the lid uncovered, and here is our bread. Okay, have you ever seen that movie Ratatouille? Remember how Ratatouille holds the bread up to his ear and he says, you know how you can test a really good bread? By the sound it makes. We have that with this bread. So we have a nice crusty sourdough loaf, and I wanted to explain two concepts to you. One is the ear, and this is where you've scored, and this has allowed the expansion to happen. And sometimes you will have a small ear, and that might mean you have a very high hydration, and if you wanted to get a prominent ear, you might want to reduce your hydration percentage. And you also have this wonderful blistering, which is indicative of sourdough. But quite frankly, if it tastes good, who cares? So I am going to cut this bread. And if you are an avid sourdough person, you might want to join some of those Facebook groups for sourdough, and sometimes they talk about different knives. And what's the best knife to get? A regular bread knife will work. However, my neighbor actually gave me an electric carving knife, and I use this to cut my bread. So I'm going to cut this bread, and then we're going to look at the crumb and see how the crumb looks. All right. So a lot of people say let it cool down to room temperature or even overnight before eating. This is personal preference. I would recommend you not diving into your bread right out of the oven, because there is a lot of steam and the crumb will tend to be a little gummy or wet. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to cut it right down the middle. And here you have your sourdough bread. So this part here is the crumb, and there is a fine line between overproofing and underproofing. Overproofing is when your bread rises, and then because it's overproofed, it'll collapse. You can tell that this is definitely not overproofed because we have this wonderful ear. And we also have these gas bubbles, which just shows that the sourdough was nice and active. Sometimes when you have a lot of big holes, it means it's underproofed, but this is not the case for this one. These just have airy holes, which means it's just well proofed. The rising of the dough is fairly even here. So this is a good proof, and what I did was actually a 48-hour cold proof, which I have found is the best duration for proofing. But that's what you need to experiment with, and also whether time allows for you. But I just schedule my bread making so that I do get a 48-hour cold proof. This is a really nice loaf. Usually with whole wheat bread, you will find that because it's whole wheat and it has that kernel, you tend to have a denser bread. But because we actually hydrated our whole wheat flour, this allowed it to rise a lot more. So those are two tips that I hope you got from this video. I hope this video series has been helpful to you. Happy baking, and if you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comments section. More recipes can be found on sammywongskitchen.com or social media. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks!